Give a good Wichita welcome to David Bobb.
Well, thanks so much for that warm welcome. It's wonderful to see so many liberty lovers out this morning, and I look forward to our opportunity to really have a conversation about the future of freedom, the future of free speech in this country. One of the things that I think has really been interesting to see is, just as of late, how questions about the state of free speech have boiled over on our campuses. And I want to spend time talking about what's been happening in higher education, but also to really plumb the depths a little bit more and try to understand how is it that we've come to this place, that you can see students clamoring for what they would call safe spaces. Students saying that they need to have the right to be really left alone, to be left in their own opinions, free from the challenge that might be presented to them from other views. You know, it was a few years ago that I ordered a copy of the United States Constitution. It was from a little-known publisher. I hadn't seen them, but I was curious about what they would do just in the packaging of the document. You can download the Constitution anywhere, but this particular collection of primary source documents had the Constitution and the Declaration and a couple of other of our founding documents. And it was with some curiosity that I flipped it open. And I read this, and here I'm quoting directly from a published version, 2008, of the Constitution. Quote, "This book is a product of its time and does not reflect the same values as it would if it were written today. Parents might wish to discuss with their children how views on race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and interpersonal relations have changed since this book was written before allowing them to read this classic work." So there's your trigger warning for the day. We're going to be talking about the Constitution. And what's funny about this, while you might, as I did, kind of chuckle a little bit, is that while that particular publisher decided to put that in writing, the de facto setting in many of our presentations today about the Constitution is something like that. They might not articulate it that way. The presentation by faculty in our universities might not start with that kind of an explicit warning, trigger warning, in our classrooms across the country, in the halls of academia, but also in the boardrooms. The way that we talk about our role as citizens, the way that we come to an understanding of how we can have vigorous discourse is changing. And I would say that it's changing for the worse, that we have become all too used to a kind of mode of operation in this country where we self-censor. Let me relate this to a couple of things that have happened recently, a couple of kind of data points or some anecdotal evidence as to where we've been, and then I'd like to talk about where we might go. You know, there was a recent poll that was done. This was conducted by James Madison's Montpelier. I'm going to say a little bit more about Madison and the handout that you all have, courtesy of John Todd. Thank you for everything that you've done, and to Susan for making this possible this morning. But a recent survey done by James Madison's Montpelier revealed that about 40% of young people said that they would be willing to ditch the Constitution. 40%. Now, in 2014, 48 United States senators seconded that motion because what they voted on was an effort to amend our First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The language that 48 United States senators affirmed was this, quote, "Congress and the states may regulate and set reasonable limits on the raising and spending of money by candidates and others to influence elections." Now, in previous work, I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and I came to know a lot of members of both houses of the United States Congress. And one thing that I noticed was that there was a trend at work, and there was a lot of people that could pull out, let's see if I have a pocket copy here. So they'd be quick to brandish a pocket copy of the United States Constitution and to wave it around. Perhaps you've seen some elected official do that. And it kind of came as evidence that by so doing, they could demonstrate their good faith with this document. Now, if any one of those members on that day in 2014, when they voted to amend the United States Constitution and to effectively dismantle the First Amendment, if they didn't have their pocket copy of the Constitution handy, let me just read for you what the First Amendment to the United States Constitution says. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how it came to be that we had 10 amendments to the United States Constitution that we know as the Bill of Rights. But that statement there is pretty clear. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And yet efforts have been made in the wake of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision to undo that ruling. And there's a national movement, it's not just in Washington, D.C., to suggest that at certain times and at certain places and in certain ways, the right of the people to express their opinions and to back those opinions up with monetary contributions shall in fact be abridged. Can you imagine, for example, as was at stake in that particular Supreme Court decision, that there ought to be a sort of window in front of an election during which you can do less, say less, be less involved in trying to influence the way that your elected officials vote? Well, to many commentators, that seems like a pretty clear abridgment of free speech. And yet right now, I think, this question is very much up for grabs, not only in elections across the country, but in so many of our day-to-day conversations. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, the biggest threat, I think, we can look to what's happening in higher education. And let me introduce one other piece of evidence because I think this was really interesting. So last week, for the 50th year in a row, the University of California at Los Angeles and a research center there released some data on the attitudes of freshmen across the country. And what they found is a couple of interesting things. The first thing is that they predict that based on the attitudes and opinions expressed by those freshmen, that there's going to be a lot more of the kind of political activism, the kind of protests that we saw recently on the campus of the University of Missouri, at Yale University, at Princeton, at a host of schools across the country. You know, there have been more than 50 that have seen that. Those were the headliners, but there were more than 50 colleges and university campuses at which there were various protests in the last year. But this particular study says that based on the trajectory that's there, there's going to be a lot more political activism. Students are expressing that they are much more civically engaged. So you might say, well, okay, maybe that's a positive sign. You might not agree with the way that those protests are going down. You might not be in agreement with what even they're protesting. But here's the interesting thing. Along with that expressed interest in greater activity by young people, there are also these sentiments. Close to half of the freshmen said that they agree strongly or agree somewhat that colleges, quote, have the right to ban extreme speakers from campus. Now, of course, you might wonder, well, what does extreme mean? But lately, there have been a spate of people that have been disinvited. And they range from Bill Maher to Hersey Ali to George Will to the head of the International Monetary Fund. Are those folks extreme? The other thing that they noted in this particular survey is that a significant majority, 71% to be exact, of respondents, again, these are freshmen at the college level, strongly agree or agree somewhat that, quote, colleges should prohibit racist or sexist speech on campus. So that's at 71%. And if you go back about 20 years, that was at a level of about 60%. Then think about going back another 30 years before that, and what did the free speech movement stand for? One of those campuses that recently tried to get one of those speakers that I just mentioned disinvited was the University of California, Berkeley, where the free speech movement originated. What we see throughout our schools, and not just in the state of California, though there you see some of the most interesting episodes. Another one that I have to tell you about is, so there was a gentleman, do you all know Constitution Day? September 17th every year, the date on which the Constitutional Convention adjourned its work in 1787. There's various commemorations that are done. In fact, schools across the country will mark this day by reading the Constitution, by allowing students to gather. And one particular junior college student in the state of California decided that on that day he wanted to make available to his fellow students little pocket copies of the Constitution. And what he failed to do that day was to sign up so that he could stand in a designated space about the area right here in front that was designated a free speech zone on his campus. He forgot about that. Can you imagine? The audacity to go on his campus, a public community college, and decide that he would on Constitution Day hand out copies of the Constitution. And what in fact happened there is that he was told that he had to stop and that he needed to sign up for a particular day in the future so that he could stand in that designated free speech zone and do the thing that the United States Constitution, without any limitations expressed therein, said that he could do on any day of the year. And you might think, well, that's kind of an outlier case. But in fact, when you look across the campus, some 50% of our colleges and universities have speech codes. 50%. Now that number is coming down. And so there's some countervailing trends here, but the overall thing that is at work, I think, is very deleterious to the level of discourse that we should want to see in the marketplace of ideas. Because the most dangerous thing, right, we can quantify some of those attitudes, we can look at some of the surveys, we can look at some of the evidence that's out there, but there is no way to come to a quantification of the number of people who are simply self-censoring, who are saying, you know what, I don't want to risk the trouble that that young man got into. I don't want to be pulled before some kangaroo court on campus. I don't want to meet the wrath of my professor. Or I don't want to face retribution from any other stakeholder, so I am just going to decide to not say something. Imagine how often that happens across the country, with people clamming up. People deciding that I better not go there. I better not say that thing. There's no way to come to a tally of how often that's happening. But my own working hypothesis is this. The Bill of Rights Institute exists to reach students at the high school level and to work with the educators across the land to really stir a marketplace of ideas, to present to those students the story of the United States so that they can come to an understanding of who they are as an individual, as an American citizen, and ultimately that they can understand their role. What does it mean to be a good human being? What does it mean to have a voice? Any of you who have worked with teenagers or have teenagers in the house know that it's a difficult thing. Students at the age of 16 are grappling with, why do I matter? What is it that I should be doing in life? And the task that we have before us, I believe, is to instruct them in a way, to give them the critical thinking skills, the ability to know what they should know and be able to apply it so that they can gain a voice and become a productive member of our society. It's not an easy task. But what we see all too often at the high school level is whereas there ought to be robust debate, there ought to be a taking up of all kinds of different topics. Too often there's a tendency by teachers especially, and then of course the students are taking their signals from their schools, to avoid those things that are most controversial. You know how they say you shouldn't talk about religion and politics in polite company? We think at the Bill of Rights Institute there are few other topics that are more worthy of our attention than that intersection of religion and politics, for example. And you can do that, regardless of what you believe about those things, in a way that is fair-minded and open, in a way that would stir the kind of conversation that ought to be happening at our dinner tables, but doesn't as much as I wish it would today. And it surely should be happening in our classrooms. And what we're seeing across the country, because we work at the Bill of Rights Institute with 1 in 4 of America's educators, we've had a particularly strong group of those teachers here in this state, and every year have the pleasure of working with many of them across the country, not only in this city, but across the country and in this state in particular, going in and talking to the teachers and hearing from them about what topics do you want to take up. So for instance, we've just published a curriculum on the topic of religious liberty. What is our heritage of religious liberty in this country? How did we come to the place where that is celebrated and seen as a strength? And what we hear from these teachers across the country, whether it's that topic or other topics like immigration, for example, or if you're going to talk about certain aspects of our foreign policy, they say, I am fearful of bringing up differing perspectives in the classroom because somebody at my school, whether it might be a parent or more often an administrator, is going to tell me that I should not go there. And so there's a kind of chilling effect that has happened when too many teachers across the land, instead of running into that place of controversy, they're shying away from it. You know, right after 9/11, for example, in the Dearborn Public Schools, I had a friend who taught there, and right after 9/11, in the school district that has the highest percentage of Arab Americans in the country, there was a memo issued that they were not to talk about that thing that happened on September 11, 2001. Now, what do you suppose those students wanted to talk about? What do you suppose those teachers wanted to talk about? What was the whole nation talking about? It's not just a teachable moment, for that term reduces it to something as if it's just to be a part of a pedagogical process. The questions that we're not asking are those things on which the very future of our country are staked. And unless we start early, unless we start with our students at the middle school level with age-appropriate conversations about things that are hard, about topics that are tough, they're not going to gain the skills, the habits of heart and mind that will equip them for what comes after high school, be that college and university or the workplace. And my own working hypothesis is that for a long time now we've graduated students that are so inured to having their opinions challenged, so comfortable in those safe spaces, so-called, that have been carved out for them in high schools, that when they are met by challenges in higher education, a position that might be different from their own, their reaction is one not of level-headedness, but as you might have seen from the campus of Yale University, to accost those who are challenging them and to say that what we do not want is intellectual challenge, but a kind of intellectual coddling. Now, the students might not put it exactly that way, right? They're not saying, please coddle me. But the effect of the movement that is afoot is to do that thing. And what's really interesting, you know, it was already a couple of decades ago that there was a lot of talk in this country about the political correctness that was sweeping our campuses. And a lot of that emanated from faculty members. And what we're seeing today is that a lot of it is instigated by students. They're the ones who are asking for the trigger warnings. They're the ones who are complaining about microaggressions. They're the ones who want to say, don't bother me with those opinions or facts that are different than my own. I just want to be left in my safe space. And so this time around, what you're seeing is faculty members across the ideological spectrum that are raising alarm bells and saying, this has gotten to a place that is very problematic indeed. And that we have a real danger here. Because if we have a nation of people who want only a kind of reinforcement of the view that they already hold, what kind of nation are we going to be? If all you can do when you're met with a challenge to your opinions is shout, what kind of a conversation are we going to have? And you know what? I think we've come to a place in this country where, as happened on the campus of the University of Missouri, the call that we all want is kind of like that journalism professor said, bring me some muscle. Do you recall that? So there's a student protest, right? And there's journalists that are there interviewing the students. And this journalism professor was asking for what she termed muscle. What did she mean by that? She meant somebody that could come in and get rid of not the students, but the journalists. For the journalists had the audacity to ask those students that were protesting some questions. And muscle is a metaphor for the kind of force that the state has. Muscle is precisely that thing which the First Amendment was erected to guard against. Muscle is force, and our nation was founded upon the rule of law. It was founded upon the idea that we, the people, have the say, and that the Constitution is erected not to reflect will and force and muscle, but reason. Let me talk just a little bit about James Madison, because I think what you see in his life is a remarkable demonstration of why it is that that attitude that has become too prevalent today of get me some muscle, of why that is so dangerous. James Madison started off his life as a person who didn't have a lot of, he wasn't a sort of imposing physical presence, let's say. So he's a guy that's born into privilege, right, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state where I reside. His dad was the wealthiest landowner. He had a lot of brothers and sisters. And Madison, from a very early age, was really smart and studious. He had the luxury, because of his upbringing, of having private tutors. And he was sent off to college, what is now Princeton University, then called the College of New Jersey, at an early age. And he was able to emerge from that institution in half the time that it took most students. He had a ferocious work ethic. He had an amazing ability to pull information together and a keenly analytic mind. So about the time that he was ending his couple of years on campus, he decided that he wanted to learn his fifth language, study Hebrew with the president of the university there, the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, a Scotsman by birth who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He stayed on for that extra semester to read Hebrew and study things that were, to him, really interesting. He was trying to figure out, do I want to become a lawyer? The path of the law was not attractive as it was to so many of our other founders. Do I want to become a minister? He didn't choose that direction either. And like so many of our young people today, after they finished college, Madison ended right back where he had come from, back at home. And his job was to teach his siblings various courses and to kind of become their tutor. Madison wasn't very happy with this arrangement. he would write his buddies that he went to college with, and he said, "You got to tell me about your life because right now mine is not particularly interesting. What are you doing with your life? Because right now I don't see what I should do, what my calling is really." And as he did look around himself in Virginia, he began to notice one thing that caught his attention. And that is that in a neighboring county, there were people called Baptists. And they had to operate in their religious convictions under pressure from those who had the backing of the state.
If you want to move around, we've got you covered.
Great. The question that really occurred to James Madison was, why is it that these people who are exercising their religious convictions and operating out of safety and with no threat to anybody else, why is it that they were sometimes in jail, that they were tortured, and that they were kept from exercising their religious convictions? Why was that happening? And Madison, in his young heart, resolved that he was not going to stand for that. And he said that what he wanted to do was to fight that kind of tyranny. Because what it was the Anglican majority was able to take the muscle that the state gave it and by sheer force of majority will say to any other religious minority, we're going to make it very difficult for you to exercise your religion. And Madison thought that just because you could get 50% plus one, that didn't mean that you could tell others whatever they could do. That didn't mean that you could lord over their lives. And this became a central insight in his 40 years of work advocating on behalf of the rights of all Americans. Madison's story doesn't get told very often because it isn't full of the same sort of fireworks. You know, he was a studious person. He was a quiet person too. I mentioned his slight stature. He stood as an adult about 5 feet 3 inches tall, weighed maybe 100 pounds soaking wet. When Madison was talking and other people were recording the notes, oftentimes there was a note inaudible. You couldn't hear him. He didn't like to speak publicly, even though he did throughout his career. He was one of those individuals that was always ahead of the rest of the team, though. He was so far thinking and far ahead in his planning that, for example, at the Constitutional Convention, he came in with a plan. And his plan was, we got to get George Washington there. And so he'd write to everybody. You know how you get those invitations where they have a kind of luminary, and then you see the little asterisk, invited? Maybe they haven't been confirmed yet. That's what Madison did with Washington's attendance at the Constitutional Convention. He was saying to all of the fellow delegates that he needed to be there showing up in Philadelphia, for it wasn't a sure thing that that thing was going to work. A previous gathering to amend the Articles of Confederation failed. They didn't get enough people. But he said, George Washington's going to be there. Trust me. And for months on end, he worked every angle to get George Washington there. And he came up with a plan. And just as soon as Washington arrived in May of 1787, do you know that they walked into what is now we call Independence Hall? The two men, you can imagine them standing there. There was to be a group of 40, 50 people there, and there were a couple of other individuals that had arrived, and they were from Philadelphia. Now he'd prevailed. George Washington, the leader of our revolutionary effort, General Washington, is there, ready to start deliberation on the Constitution, and few others have joined. It was that kind of moment when Madison's drive, determination, and real brilliance was able to shine. Because while Washington could have very easily said, you know what, I'm out of here. You think I'm going to wait around while people trickle in and we get this thing going? He stuck around. And what Madison did for the next few days, and in fact it took more than a week before they reached a quorum, was to get to work. And he proposed a plan. And that plan became the kind of original blueprint for the Constitution. And do you know that over the next 4 months, long, hot months in the summer, an unusually hot summer in Philadelphia, no air conditioning, they wouldn't remove their coats, right? Because that was the style of the day. They wanted to be in keeping with that. So laboring through that all summer long on key votes, vote after vote about the United States Constitution. The father of the Constitution, James Madison, was outvoted in a majority of those things. Yet he stuck to it. He realized that it wasn't about his handiwork. It wasn't about his ego. It wasn't about his getting even his way. But it was rather about the incorporation of those principles in that document that would say to those who stood for muscle, you will not prevail here. Madison's study of history had revealed to him this, that nearly every other regime in the history of humanity had been about force, had been about majority rule, had been about things in which whoever had 50% plus one would get to call the shots. And what he resolved is that that is not justice, and that the American way can be a different way, that we can forge a different path, and that we can, if we can do so, we will be the first regime in the history of the world to do so. That was his vision. There are many people today that would say of James Madison, he really wasn't the father of the Constitution, he wasn't a very good president, he was a slave, his dad was a slaveholder, Madison himself was a slave owner. Why should we pay any attention to what he did? They say the same thing about Thomas Jefferson. One of the complaints of the protesters at the University of Missouri was that Thomas Jefferson has a statue on that campus. And there have been efforts across the land directed at other founding fathers with that same litany of complaints. And what I think they fail to see is that however imperfect the actions of any individual might be, the standard that they put forward for all of us was one that is very high indeed. And that standard was, shall we live according to a regime in which rights are accorded to all and special privileges are given to none? We're not going to have in this country a special tribunal that asks, are you the right religion? Are you saying the right thing? Do you believe the right things? For that had been the history of humanity. That thing that Jefferson and Madison, for 40 years working together, came into fruition in the forging of our country. And it's interesting, since we're talking about free speech, let me round out kind of the story by telling you about how we came to have a Bill of Rights. For Madison, originally, before he was for the Bill of Rights, was against it. And so was his co-author in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton. Here was their logic. If we write down all of the rights that we have, it might imply that if they're not written down, we don't have them. And in fact, that's not the way to look at rights. Because the way that we have rights is not because government says it, or we write them down on a piece of paper, right? Have any of you read the Soviet Union's constitution? It's a remarkable document. It's brilliant in its formulations. And it was utterly unacted on, right? Everything in that constitution was contravened, but they had it on paper. Madison had a term for that. It was just a parchment barrier, right? It's just a piece of paper. And his worry was that if we write down our rights, if we don't put one of them in, then people might think that they don't have that right as well. So there's a kind of logical critique that he had initially in the debate over the Bill of Rights. Now, there were a lot of people across the land that just as soon as the Constitutional Convention got done with its work in 1787, what did it do? It had to send it out to the states, right? And the states put together long lists of their concerns. And chief among them was that, like a lot of their state constitutions, it didn't have a Bill of Rights. And so there were about 200 plus things that they noted ought to be included in a statement of the Bill of Rights. Now, that would be a very long list indeed. I don't know precisely how long the Constitution of the state of Kansas is, but some of them run to 300,000 words long in this country. They put every little thing, every little policy position into the Constitution, and thus, after a while, people grow less reverent of the thing. Madison's concern was you don't lard up the Constitution with a bunch of extraneous stuff. You keep it short, simple, and like any law, our supreme law of the land has to be understood by everyone. It has to be understandable. Have any of you taken up, as you're reading before bedtime, say Dodd-Frank or one of the laws? Obamacare, right? Sarbanes-Oxley. I met a person on the Hill that claimed to have read every one of the 1,800 pages of Obamacare. Blurry-eyed kind of individual at that point, right? But it's not a law. It's not a law in the sense that it is universally applicable, that it is understandable, that it is a rational thing. It's a concatenation of rules, of to be determined laters, of things that are going to be done by an executive agency, not by the lawmakers. And there was utter disregard, not only in that thing, and not only by the president who signed it, but there has been an utter disregard by members of both political parties of the fact that any law in this country has to be consistent with the Constitution. Madison's perspective on that was if you can't lay your finger on the part in the Constitution where the law is justified, then you can't sign it into law. And I think that's a pretty reasonable standard. But we have departed very far from that idea. And I can tell you we do not teach anything like that at all. For in our textbooks today, if you see the word Constitution, normally what you see is the word living before it. Living Constitution. Today we've made the Declaration of Independence a dead letter, and we've made the Constitution living. That is the Declaration of Independence and its promise of equality for all human beings. Its affirmation of the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's been left behind. That's an old, outmoded notion. For Woodrow Wilson, for example, it was horse and buggy. Right? We've come into, he said, a new understanding. We don't need that old-fashioned understanding that your rights come from the laws of nature and of nature's God. We rather, in our new enlightened state in the 20th century, can realize that government is the grantor of your rights. And that's the kind of standard that is adduced in most of our textbooks. And that view, by the way, wasn't just Wilson and the Democrats. It was adopted by a lot of progressives, including Teddy Roosevelt to a large degree as well, a Republican. Madison stood, before there was ever those kind of innovations, for a view of the Constitution that it had to be inspired by enduring truths. Now, even as those 200 plus complaints against the Constitution were written up, Madison was also, as committed to principle as he was a man who was very much a politician. And I use that term in the best sense of it. He was a statesman. He understood that you had to be prudent about things. If he and Hamilton and the others who were against the Bill of Rights had taken their stand and said, nope, we're not doing it, there very likely would not have been a Constitution of the United States. And that's the determination ultimately that he came around to. So then once having made that determination, he said, all right, let's take those 200 and we'll chop them down to a manageable number, say 60 or so, and then we'll get them down to about 20. And then Madison himself took it down to 12. And as an elected member of the United States Congress from Virginia, he was a member of the House, Madison was able to introduced those 12 amendments to the Constitution. So the First Amendment wasn't actually first. The First Amendment was third in the order that Madison had. It's kind of taken on an air of superiority as it being first in line. It actually, in his original, would have been third. It's still really important, and Madison fought to get the kind of language that was in it that we've come to know. But the idea then finally was, let's take these Bill of Rights and introduce them so that they don't change anything of the Constitution itself. They're an integrated whole. And you think about what the 9th and 10th Amendments say. It addresses those initial concerns, right, that Madison and Hamilton and others had, which is, look, if a right is not in the Bill of Rights, don't worry, you still have that plenary grant of rights as the people. Right? It gets that logic, that understanding, and then also the federalism, the structural argument in the 10th Amendment, which is that it's primarily the states where the activity is going to be. It's not going to be coming from Washington, D.C. That was the idea behind Congress shall make no law. Right? You see a disability there. It's not enabling. It's not saying what we want to welcome are a bunch of intrusions upon these freedoms from our national government. Insofar as there's going to be a conversation about what ought to be regulated and what ought to be taxed and all of the other kind of questions that animate our public policy, those questions ought to be happening, and that debate ought to be happening in your states. That's the position that Madison came around to. And that's how our Bill of Rights came to be. And I think what his example tells us, it really gives us a great sort of charge, even though he lived a long time ago. And even though to young people today he can seem kind of a dinosaur, right? One of those dead old white guys. Madison's example in his own life tells us three things, I think. Three ways that we can be involved and that we can really defend free speech. And the first of those is very simple, and it goes to that point of don't self-censor. Stand up for what you believe. Do so in a civil way. Do so in a way that's meant to win the argument and win the person over. It's not just to score rhetorical points. That was something that Madison did throughout his career that I think we're well advised to do today. The second thing is, in addition to not being passive and not self-censoring, be a gadfly. Be a gadfly for good. You know, Socrates was the most famous gadfly perhaps in history. And he ended up drinking the hemlock as a result. He paid the ultimate price for adhering to the life of philosophy, the life of the mind that he saw as so important. But Madison was a type of gadfly himself. For he said to the powers that be, you're not going to exercise your power just because you have muscle. That's not a good reason. In fact, that's not a reason at all. You have to give a reason. In this country, you have to mount a case for why you should be elected to office, why you should be given by we the people any power at all. And so in your communities, in the schools in which you have involvement, in your families, continue to goad those kind of conversations that are really going to help move the country forward. And that, I think, is really the third and final lesson. Model for young people around you the habits of heart and mind that would encourage civil discourse. Challenge their opinions. You know, Harvard University recently had a placemat. This placemat was delivered to all of the students, I guess, and maybe some of you have seen this thing. I think the upshot of it was, so when you go back, that is the students at Harvard University, to those proverbial dinner table conversations, say over the Thanksgiving holiday or any other occasion in which you might talk with your family, kind of advice on how you could do so. And one of the points that they said was, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. And I thought, well, I think what they're kind of getting at is, for that uncle or aunt who really drives you crazy, and they're always spouting off some nonsense about free speech or something like that, talking about the Constitution. Don't get flustered. Take a deep breath, right? It's kind of patronizing. I mean, it's downright insulting, right? To suppose that students need advice in order to really go home and correct their parents and those around them. That's what it's saying. Our universities today have taken that attitude all too often. Google, if you care to see an example of this, Yale University. And then you can put in the additional search item, shrieking girl. There was a young woman who was part of a house, and she confronted the housemaster, who had the audacity to issue a statement seconding his wife is also in that same house, and both of them are academics at Yale. They're teachers, scholars. And they suggested that about Halloween, that things had gotten a little bit out of hand when the administration sent around a memo saying that you shouldn't wear offensive Halloween costumes. And this particular couple said basically, you know what? We don't think the university ought to be issuing memos like that. We think students ought to be able to figure out what you ought to wear for something like Halloween. And you know what? It wouldn't be the absolute worst thing in the world if your costume happened to offend somebody else, because what they can do then is not only be offended, but tell you they don't like your costume. And you know what? That's kind of the way that life works. That you go about having a conversation and a discourse, and that there's a marketplace of ideas, and that we don't take preemptive action to shut down the marketplace before it even opens. And this student and a gaggle of students decided that this action by these particular faculty members was absolutely out of bounds. And they started shouting at this individual. And the woman who wrote that initial response to the administration has since pulled back from her teaching. She's decided that it's not worth it. That the absolutely stinging criticism and rebuke that she felt all around her at this university was not worth it. Now, what we see at the high school level is even that much more alarming. Because if you can be a faculty member, credentialed, important, and have your voice shut down, what do you think about that 16-year-old that feels surrounded by opinions that are not of his or her own in a classroom setting with a teacher who may not be able to facilitate a good and reasonable conversation? That student's going to shut up. And we don't even know what is going to be in her voice. We don't even know what things she might discover or say, or the realizations and epiphanies that she might come to. For once you shut yourself up, you also start to shut down those kind of thinking processes. And I think that's really what's at stake today. We hear from a lot of the students that we work with across the country as they come to our various programs that they feel lonely in their schools because they feel like if they express any interest in things about, say, the American founding, history, or if they want to act on some of those convictions and get involved politically, not necessarily even in partisan politics, but just to stir a conversation about such things, that they are discouraged from doing that. This may not be a memo from the administrators telling them to shut up, but it's a vibe. It's a signal nonetheless. It's a sentiment that they feel like they shouldn't be involved, like they shouldn't be doing that thing. And so we've launched a series of programs, one of them called Constitution Connection, in which students across the political spectrum can voice their views on a question like, for example, should the minimum wage be raised? Big issue for high school students, right? Sounds pretty attractive to go from $7.50 to $15, right? Who wouldn't vote yourself a pay raise? A doubling of your pay, right? Well, what we ask the students to do is not only to weigh in yes or no on that question, but also to justify their opinion based on the Constitution and the principles of liberty. And to do so in a really short statement online. And then they can vote for the best person that justifies it. Again, whether it's yes or no. That's the second question we posed. The first question we posed to students was, should college be free? Some of you might be thinking, it's actually not free, right? It's free kind of in quotation marks, right? You know that while there might be a breakfast or a college bill that might be free, somebody's paying for it. Well, I can tell you that the results of that first experiment were about 60% of the students voted for free college education, and 40% were on the no side. And that tracks about where I think students are at in a lot of these polls on free speech and a lot of other areas and issues that you all are concerned with. Students are particularly malleable sort, though, because at the high school level, what they're trying to do is figure out, who am I? What's my purpose in life? They're not thinking about conservative, progressive, Republican, Democrat yet. They're just trying to figure out, what is it that I should believe? Where can I find my home? Intellectually, socially, morally, spiritually? They're trying to sort out all of those things. And so what we're doing is designing a series of programs and projects that can be done both through their teachers and also done directly with those students. And so much now can be conducted online, where we're stirring a kind of national conversation, a debate. We work with the National Speech and Debate Association, the largest of its kind in terms of formal debate, and have a video program right now where students can weigh in on issues like those that I just mentioned, also liberty and security, debates related to foreign policy, related to all kinds of different questions that invite them to come in and have a say. We do a lot of teacher programs as well where we're doing the same kind of thing, teaching the debate, and really training the teachers through professional development programs like one that we'll be holding in this city next week. So if you know any teachers, send them to the billofrightsinstitute.org. And there, under teacher programs, there's a sign up. It's free to teachers. They get the SEAT and continuing education units that are useful for their own professional development. And they hear from a leading scholar on topics of the day pegged to the curriculum that we publish. We worked with the Templeton Foundation on a 3-year project called Documents of Freedom. And one of the documents that you have in front of you there is drawn from that curriculum, James Madison's little piece called Property. What we do with teachers is point them in the direction of primary source documents so that they can really gain a sense of the words and ideas of the founders. The words and ideas from every era of history, and then try to look at the evidence. And that's, you might say, what education has always been about, but unfortunately we've come a long ways from that place. So we feel like we're trying to go back to an older place in the American educational sort of tradition, but doing so with an updated technology. Because when a kid can access all of those primary source documents on his or her smartphone, we have evidence of just how much that stuff gets used. You know, teachers still get handed to them those old, like, 10-pound textbooks. In the state of California, they had to make it almost came to be a law that you couldn't have textbooks over a certain weight because they were seeing so many kids going to chiropractors, right? I don't know if you've ever flipped through one of those textbooks. Ask your kid or your grandkids to see one of them. They're not very good. Usually what kids say is #boring, right? They're just not interesting. But even more, they're ideologically biased. What if you could have a text, primary source documents, in which you're really enlivening the conversation, which you're piquing their curiosity, in which you're forcing them to grapple with those words? One of the most common requests that we get is, can you come up with an easier to read version of the Federalist Papers? And thus far we've resisted and said, no. Read the Federalist Papers with your students. Work through that language. Yes, it's hard, but it pays dividends. There's a logical precision to the way in which those were written. And just as you read the Federalist Papers, so too should you read speeches from FDR and LBJ. And you should compare them. And then when a student is ready, you should ask them, what do you think? But too often today what we do is reverse that, or never even take in the history part of it. And all we ask is, what do you think? When I would get a paper teaching at the college level that began with, I feel, I would always cross out that word. Because education is about moving from opinion to knowledge, and then from knowledge to wisdom. What I want to do is stop there. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'd be happy to take your questions, comments, thoughts on this subject or anything else that you'd like to bring up. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. Our tradition is to walk around with a roving mic so that the audience can hear the questions. So,
in the Constitution, pretty consistently, the Founding Fathers sided with Parliament against the King. One exception is the religion test. What role did Madison play in putting that in?
It was one that he absolutely supported. And that it's funny, the Constitution doesn't say, except for the First Amendment, with those two, what have come to be known as the two religion clauses, the Constitution is otherwise silent on religion with that notable exception. And that is that at the federal level, there can be no religious test. Think of what that meant. Still to this day, the British monarch is the head of a church. How's that church doing? How healthy is it? How healthy is any established church? That was Madison's perspective, that just as soon as the state establishes the church, what is going to be harmed in the process is both the cause of religion and, for what it's worth, the state itself. But his greater concern, and that of the Founding Fathers, was for the health and robust development and maturation of civil society. And so they said, in our country, the president's not going to be head of a church. And in fact, what Madison and Jefferson did, which I think is really the most signal and amazing accomplishment, their work in the Commonwealth of Virginia to disestablish the Anglican Church was a monumental triumph. And what Madison did after that long, hard fight, it was a nasty struggle. For example, at one point, so Jefferson and Madison are on one side and Patrick Henry is on the other. Patrick Henry thought that kids were watching too much MTV and that they were kind of paying attention to their smartphones too much and that their kind of moral situation was going way down. And so he wanted to increase the money that was allotted to the official church in the state of Virginia. And Madison and Jefferson had to say, we respectfully disagree. Not only do we want to see less money, we want to see no money. It shouldn't exist. And Jefferson was a rather impatient fellow. I talked about Madison's amazing kind of patience, and Jefferson was over in Paris. Henry was the most effective legislator in the Virginia legislature. He was standing against the bill that Jefferson put forward. And Jefferson complained to Madison that what we need to do, and here I quote Jefferson, is devoutly pray for Henry's death. Now, Madison wrote him back and said that might be a little bit extreme. Why don't we instead get him elected governor? And there's good evidence that they, in fact, kind of working behind the scenes, got Henry out of the state legislature into the less powerful governor's seat, where they could then pass that bill over his objections. And in fact, after 8 years, they finally passed what has come to be known as the Bill for Establishing Religious Liberty. That thing in Virginia came to inform the United States Constitution. And sometimes you'll hear that the separation of church and state is a myth. It's not a myth. It's not what the ACLU will tell you what it is, but there is, in fact, a separation of church and state in this sense, that the state is not the church and the church is not the state. They are different institutions for very good reasons. Because once you get the state involved in salvation, all kinds of things run amok. Right? Think about our presidential contest today. And whoever you're backing, would you want that individual presiding over a church? And it's because so many of us today answer no that we can credit James Madison for making that the case. Because in all of the states there were established churches, and Madison and Jefferson were a very distinct minority in saying this is a really bad idea.
Yeah, the progressives were able to get over that rudder called education and change the way the ship was going. Do you see any rapid way to get the curriculum back to teaching American values and the American system?
It's a great question, and thank you for that. I think that just about at the same time that the progressive movement was in full swing in the early part of the 20th century, there came to be something called social studies. Social studies has largely supplanted civics. And we work with social studies educators across the country. We affirm the work that they do. Teachers do an amazing job, so many of them. And most will, I say, they love America. They don't always know why. And I think that that's the result of many generations now of an educational system that has not equipped any of us to know very well that question. Now, here's the good news, though, that there are things, and this is not just technology, but there are things like school choice, opportunities for families to pull their kids from traditional public schools and pursue different options. Now, I think the founders were in favor of public education. In fact, I know that they were. They were very clear in their statements about it. They were in favor of public education insofar, though, as that would be controlled by the local level. And that is that it would be controlled by parents, right? And so whether you support traditional public schools, charter schools, which I know are very hard to start in this state, and it should not be so. It should be easy to do so, I believe. Whether you believe that your children should be educated at home or in private schools, be they religious or not. The idea of the American founding that we have come so far away from is that parents are the primary educators, and communities then can come around them and behind them and help them in that endeavor. If we can return to that standard, and we just at the Bill of Rights Institute, we're happy to celebrate National School Choice Week. There were 16,000 events across the country. There's now more than 3 million kids enrolled in charter schools nationwide, some 2 million at the homeschool level. And even while we affirm the great work that's being done by so many teachers in our traditional public schools, I think the main thing that we can do is, at the Institute, for example, we go directly to teachers. Teachers are the ones who are making decisions about what should go into the classroom. You know, No Child Left Behind was supposed to, 2 years ago now, have every kid in the country at 100% proficiency in reading and math. How did we do at that? Right? Washington set a standard in 2002, and they said, in 12 years, every kid in the land, K through 8th grade, is going to pass and be 100% proficient in math and reading. What do you suppose happened to those tests, by the way, that the states were charged with administering? Got pretty easy, right? If you have to have 100% passage rate. But we've scrapped No Child Left Behind in large measure, not entirely. But the mandates keep coming, whether from Topeka or from Washington, D.C. And I can tell you that every year teachers get a new 5-year plan. And a lot of them shrug it off. Because what they have to do in that classroom is educate young hearts and minds. And most of them know what an absolutely huge lift that is. And they're increasingly going to resources that are online. They take that 10-pound textbook, leave it over in the corner, and they go to resources like ours. And so a disruptive kind of marketplace of ideas is right now the best thing that can revive that tradition of being able to teach American citizenship. Because we can go in and look at that textbook that I mentioned and see that yesterday, for example, about 700 teachers accessed it. Within the last few months, more than 13,000 have done so. And we can see what sections even they're going to, which tells us, well, we probably didn't do as good a job as we should have with the second unit or that particular lesson, and we can go in and improve it. And we can be responsive to that marketplace. Right now, when Texas spends $300 million a year on textbooks, you know who they're responsive to? They're not responsive to teachers. They're certainly not responding to students and their families. What they're responding to are the big textbook publishers and the lobbying efforts that can happen at a cronyistic level. And that marks so much of right now what is a $600+ billion a year effort in this country, which is education at the K through 12 sector. And it's marked by rampant cronyism. And until we address those structural changes, we're not going to see the systemic reform that we need to. But even before we do that kind of systemic reform, we can make a lot of changes in the curriculum. That's the good news that I would share with you. So I'd encourage you, go online, check out the stuff that we have. It's all free to the end user. If you know families, if you yourself are working with kids, there's a lot of different ideas and lesson plans and things that really can engage students. Because that's what we haven't done very well, by the way, in this country. You know, progressivism in the form of John Dewey and all was about, look, we really need to get students more than just doing rote memorization. And the view that we take at the Bill of Rights Institute is that rote memorization alone doesn't do a lot of good. I think that kids ought to be memorizing things, actually. I don't think that that ought to be the warp and woof of civic education, though. But it's good to know the preamble to the Constitution. It's good to know portions of the Declaration of Independence. It's good to know the Gettysburg Address. It's also good to know dates. But if history is just one thing after another, as it so often is.
We'll take our last question over here.
I agree with everything you said, and I self-censor myself 99% of the time. That's a good thing a lot of the time. Anyways, I have 2 points. One, in regards to freedom in this country, I think we have to recognize the condition precedent that we have an intellectual and racial reign of terror. People are petrified, scared of offending blacks, Jews as Jews, and our most recent fear group, homosexuals. And until we deal with that and say this underlying atmosphere of terror and intimidation that permeates our society, of course we'll see that on campus. My other question and point is, conservatives, they always talk about freedom in the First Amendment, but would you agree that conservatives have done almost nothing about preserving free speech? The conservative legislators don't threaten to take funds away from these college people who intimidate other people. They don't stand up for free speech because conservatives, frankly, are just as whipped racially and otherwise and intimidated as liberals. Liberals actually believe it. So in a sense, conservatives are more contemptible because they're giving in to suppression of freedom out of fear rather than a warped ideology.
Yeah, so both are good and interesting questions. I think there's a lot at work in the question about what should the legislative oversight of our university system be. I think that for universities that receive public tax dollars, the idea that there should be speech codes is really anathema to the First Amendment. It's a clear violation of our Constitution. And insofar as legislators are allowing that, that's a problem. At the same time, I think it would be an abdication of their duty as lawmakers to go in and start erecting other standards and say, you have to meet these criteria. And I think whether it's conservatives or whatever ideological position you take on the spectrum, the idea that there ought to be particular inquiries into what you're saying in our institutions of higher education is a really bad idea. That's not to say that anything goes or that anybody should be able to say anything they want, but just as soon as you try to enact a standard that says this is what's prohibited and this is what's not, that I think you get into some very dangerous territory. If be it conservatives or other folks say that we ought not to politicize the classroom at whatever level, we ought not to politicize the classroom. Right? I think that's a really important thing. Insofar as your question about self-censorship, it's interesting. I'll close with this. When George Washington was elected president, he got letters from all over the country. And many of these were from religious bodies. So Presbyterians wrote them, Catholics, Baptists, Mennonites. And they all said, "Congratulations, Mr. President, and good luck in your work." One of the letters that President Washington got was from the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. Washington wrote each one of these religious groups back, and he said basically the same thing to each of them. And it was particularly meaningful, though, for this body of people in this particular congregation. Because as one historian has said, it was likely the first time that a sitting president had addressed any group of Jewish people as co-equals. In any country, right? Because what had the Jewish experience been? If you get 50% plus one that's against you, you're going to be hounded out to the next place, to the next land. Here in this country, Washington said, they and every other religious group do not need to worry about their standing. For it's not on account of religion that they have rights. It's on account of their being human beings and citizens of this country that they do. And that, I think, is the way that we should understand these questions of particular divisiveness. That we have rights, those rights can be asserted, but they cannot be asserted at the expense of the rights of others. And that's where very often our courts and our lawmakers are getting it wrong. They're tilting the balance in one direction or another, and they're neglecting that founding idea of liberty and equality for all. Thanks so much for your time this morning. Really good to be with you.